This is GARIS Essays, that is 2-3 page opinion pieces on topics such as species dominance, the global state, politics, femtotech, religion, society and education. Written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. This is essay number 15, entitled I am so sick of American Singularity Pollyannists, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Abstract. I'm really tired of listening to the childlike naivety of American Singularity Pollyannists. I don't deny the probable truth of what they say when they focus on the positive things that may come from accelerating future technologies, the singularity, as Americans call it, in the coming decades. But I sneer increasingly at the narrowness and myopia of their thinking. Their childlike blindness to the possible extremely negative possibilities makes me increasingly impatient. It's almost like a religion to them. They want to believe in all the wonderful benefits of future technologies, so their minds blot out the possibility that all technological roads lead to the artificial intellect, massively intelligent machine, and hence the strong likelihood of the worst war occurring that humanity has ever known over the issue of species dominance. Do these Pollyannists truly believe that all of humanity is simply going to accept passively that humanity is to be superseded by the Artilects/cyborgs without a fight? Do they? I'm looking forward to when China's intellectuals get freedom of speech so that 1.4 million of them can devote their intellects to the domination of the dominant 21st century debate on species dominance, and bring their old world maturity to it, instead of the gullible naivety coming from the new world. This essay expresses my frustration with the current American dominance of the species dominance debate, and hopes that China will take over that role in the next decade or two by ridding it of America's lack of sophistication and historical sense. This issue is too important to be sidetracked by New World hicks, or as the French say, and I speak French, petit con américain. 1. Introduction. It's undeniable that future decades will give us miracles in technology. Moore's law, which states that the number of transistors that one can cram onto a chip keeps doubling every year, has been valid now for nearly 50 years and shows no sign of stopping. As soon as one technology exhausts its possibilities, a new one takes over. This has happened again and again. The result is the annual doubling speed of the internet. Massively powerful computers capable of simulating the full operation of the human brain, etc. Soon, we will have paper-thin, wall-sized televisions in vivid 3D, bringing us, as I say myself in several essays and a book, all the world's media, creating a world language, a culturally homogenized global culture, and a global government. Hence no more wars, no arms trade, no ignorance, no poverty, all very optimistic and rosy, yes? The American futurist pundits who talk about these things paint a very rosy picture in their typical New World fashion, making all things sound wonderful and to be looked forward to with glee. The Old World cultures, on the other hand, are much less sanguine. I was recently in Paris giving an invited talk on species dominance and the likelihood of a species dominance war, and was very happy to be met with what I felt to be a much more balanced view of the future. The old world cultures have a much longer cultural history and hence can balance the positive with the negative, since reality seems to be a real mixture of both. Old world cultures such as Europe and China have had major wars on their territories within living memory, so don't look on the future with the same level of childlike gullibility as do Americans. White Americans have not had a major war on their territory ever, unless you call the US Civil War in the 1860s as major, that is about 600,000 killed, and spread over only about half a dozen states. To get a sense of proportion, the Taiping Rebellion was going on at the same time in China, which killed 20 million. That was a major war. So were World War I, 20 million killed, and World War II, 50 to 100 million killed, confined largely to the Eurasian continent. 2. The multi-viewpoint. When I listen to American singularity/futurist pundits, I feel like a ping-pong ball bouncing back and forth between the narrow confines of two walls in the minds of these pundits. I find their thinking so narrow, so naive, so gullible, so inferior, that I'm becoming increasingly sneering and becoming ever more vocal in expressing my frustration and growing contempt. To explain why, I need to explain a bit about my multicultural background, because it is highly relevant to my views. I'm a multicultural person. I've lived in 7 countries: Australia, England, Holland, Belgium, Japan, America, China. I obviously see the world very differently from a monocultured person. As a multi, I look down on monos. I see them as unsophisticated, just as city slickers look down on country bumpkins, and for the same reason. Country bumpkins are unsophisticated and limited in their life experiences, and so are monos. Monos are typically so ignorant of their lack of multicultural sophistication that they don't even know that they are unsophisticated until told so by the multis. To the multis, monos are limited as individuals by the limitations of the one culture that programs them, whereas multis benefit from the superiorities of several cultures that program them. Typically, when multis and monos confront each other, the narrow horizons of the monos bore and frustrate the multis. If a multi complains about the limitations and inferiorities of the culture of the mono, then the mono will only see a complaining multi and not have a clue what the multi is complaining about. The mono does not have the more sophisticated multicultural basis of comparison of the multi, who can compare the inferior aspects of the culture of the mono with the superiorities of the other cultures that the multi has lived in. Such a multicultural basis for comparison lies outside the life experience of the mono. I've written a whole book, my second, about all this, called, not surprisingly, Multis and Monos: What the Multicultured Can Teach the Monocultured Towards the Creation of a Global State. It's selling very poorly in the US because compared to Europe, Americans are much more mono. They have to make a much greater effort to leave their huge country because America's states, with all their monotonous main streets in a zillion small towns and their chain stores that are the same from coast to coast, are the size of Europe's countries. Europeans can hop in their cars and drive for a few hours and be in another country with a different language and mentality. Americans can't do that. European TV is not national anymore and typically has the television of many other European countries in their TV cables. This is much less the case in the US. American television is largely under corporate control and makes its money from advertising. The IQ bell curve ensures that the majority of US TV viewers are of average intelligence, situated in the peak of the bell curve, and hence are called peakers. The morons and intellectuals are such a tiny minority of the general US population that corporate-controlled US television ignores them. These TV corporations are always competing with each other for viewers and need to cut costs. One way to do this is to reduce the number of foreign correspondents by concentrating news items onto local, that is, American issues. The result is that Americans are poorly informed about how other countries think and feel. In this sense, Americans are ignorant and gullible when it comes to multicultural thinking. America's peakered media is so dumbed down from the point of view of America's intellectuals, or sages as I call them, that they simply don't watch it. It insults their intelligence. But the result then is a much less sophisticated and informed American intelligentsia than, say, in Europe, where the media is controlled partly by governments which pitch the intellectual level of its television programs at not only the peakers but also at the subs and to the sages. The result is that European intellectuals know hugely more about the world than their American equivalents. Unfortunately for the world, because of America's intellectual dominance, its intellectual leadership is greatly inferior to what it could have been if the US were a far more sophisticated culture, which unfortunately it is not. The US is not really a country, it's more a continent. In fact, roughly speaking, the second largest country in landmass in the world, a position shared with Canada and China, which are both slightly bigger. Only Russia is a lot bigger than the US. The US has the third largest population in the world at over 320 million. Only the giants of China and India are a lot larger. The US is also blessed with huge natural resources and was colonized by the democratic British. It has therefore one of the highest standards of living in purchasing power terms in the world, and hence education is highly valued. If one defines sages as the top 1% of the population in IQ terms, who have PhDs, have ideas, and write books about them, then such people are probably 1 in 1,000. The US, therefore, has about 300,000 such sages. China has potentially 1.4 million of them. More on that later. It's therefore not surprising that the US currently dominates the world intellectual scene because of its sheer numbers and the current historical reality. The 20th century was America's, and the 21st will be China's, but the transition is yet to be made. From my own perspective, it's frustrating to see such a parvenu, unsophisticated culture as the US become the dominant global intellectual power, an attitude certainly shared by the French, who are probably the most sophisticated people on the planet, in my view. The Americans bring their lack of sophistication and gullibility to the global intellectual marketplace and create a lot of frustration and some admiration as well, of course. The Americans do, after all, dominate the Nobel and Abel prizes to the more sophisticated sages of other cultures. But from a Maltese point of view, this current American intellectual dominance is a historical aberration and will not last. It will be replaced by a far older, far larger culture with a history that goes back 5,000 years. I'm speaking of China. My next topic. 3. China, the rising dominant intellectual global power. I really am impatient to see China rise. I'd like it to take over the role from the US as the intellectual leader in the species dominance debate that will so dominate the history of the 21st century. But the US will remain the dominant intellectual power for several more decades at least. China has a lot of work to do to take over that prestigious role, but the cards are stacked in its favour. For a start, the Chinese are smarter on average than the Americans. According to many worldwide IQ measurement studies, the average IQ of Chinese and Koreans and Japanese is 105. Now I'm ad-libbing. Japanese are Koreans, genetically, in their DNA. 2,000 years ago there was a war in northeast China which forced 1 million Koreans to flee for their lives to Japan. So the early Japanese emperors are in fact Korean, and you can't tell that to the Japs. So effectively Japs are Koreans, and my Chinese wife, who was, before she retired, a professor in ancient Chinese literature and hence history and so forth, says that if you go back far enough into Chinese history, Koreans are Chinese. So Northeast Asians, Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, all with average IQ of 105, are all effectively Chinese. So China is the smartest of the large population groups in the world at about 105 average, along with Germans also about 105. Whereas in the US it's only 100, similarly in Europe, most countries in Europe. If you shift the IQ bell curve up 5 points, that has quite a significant impact on the number of genii in that smarter population, assuming the same population size. But China has over 4 times the population of the US, and its economic growth has been averaging about 10% for the past 3 decades, compared to America's average of only 3% over the same period. Thus, it's obvious that the US may be currently in a superior position, but China has a greatly superior momentum and will probably overtake the US in a few decades on all counts. It will be the largest economy in gross national product within a mere few years, by 1916 in purchasing power terms, says the IMF, and that happened, ad-libbing. The eastern coastal cities of China, such as Shenzhen, Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, etc., will be reaching purchasing power parity with the US in a decade or so, and then will sweep past the US. Their greater salaries will then attract the best brains in the world to come to China, and hence enhance China's growing reputation all the more. The US has benefited enormously from its superior salaries over the past half-century. In today's science PhD programs in the US, most of these super bright students are not Americans. They are Asians who will return to Asia with their knowledge, leaving Americans in their obese self-complacency until the shit really hits the fan, which is starting to happen now. The transition of global intellectual dominance from the US to China will be painful for the US. It has become accustomed to being number one, which is a difficult psychological crown to have to give up, but it's inevitable that it will happen. A massive brain drain to China from all over the world I expect to take place in the 2020s after China democratizes. Proviso. China was the dominant culture worldwide for a whole millennium, from about the time of the fall of the Roman Empire to the rise of the European Renaissance. It's a real pity that the Chinese did not discover science and that they turned inward on themselves to defend themselves from the invading Mongols in the 15th century. If they had continued their overseas explorations with ships 5 times the length of Columbus's Santa Maria, world history might have been very different, and most of the planet now would be speaking Chinese, the world language. Today's China, however, is a shithole. I say this as a 7-country multi who has lived nearly 6 years full-time in China. Whoa, time passes. So I have been 11 years in China as I speak. So I read this flyer, this essay 5 years ago, 2012. It has a lot of work to do to overtake the US and return to its old natural place as the dominant culture, a position it deserves given its enormous potential, but one it certainly does not deserve at the moment. I've written quite a few essays about the many inferiorities of China that will need to be fixed before China can hold its head high on the world stage. At the moment, Chinese leaders are welcomed for their checkbooks, but are despised behind their backs for being members of the greatest criminal organization in history. I think the Jewish banksters are actually worse, but I didn't know that then when I was writing this. I have written of the 70+ million of its own citizens that have been killed by the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, mostly under Mao, the greatest tyrant in history, who has killed more people than Stalin or Hitler, yet his face is still on China's money. China still has Laogai, that is, slave labour camps for political prisoners. Over 1,000 of them today, with somewhere between 0.5 to 2 million such prisons. If you look on ad-libbing, if you look on Harry Wu, W-U, website, laogaimuseum.org, I think. That website says the number of political prisoners in China today is 3 to 5 million. What a shithole. These are not the symbols of a globally dominant nation. They are the symbols of a backward, inferior shithole nation that the world despises. So if China is to take its potential place as the intellectual dominant global power, it will first have to clean up its act. It will have to democratize, one of the last major countries to do so, and a national disgrace that is so slow in starting. 90% of people who live outside China live in democracies of various shades. The CCP is on its last legs. It has to put down some 100,000, in fact I read now it's more like 200,000 political demonstrations per year, and their number keeps growing year by year. In less than a decade, 100 million Chinese tourists will be travelling overseas to democratic countries and will inevitably be influenced by the democratic freedoms that they see taken for granted in more civilized, more law-based countries and push for reform at home. China will pass the economic democracy threshold of $6,000 to $8,000 per person per year within a decade. In fact, it's already, as I speak at Living 2017, it has now reached $8,000 per person per year. So the time is right for China to democratize. Per year, within a decade, well now. When the rising middle educated class insist on the rule of law to protect their growing property and the right to vote out incompetent leaders. I predict China will democratize within a decade, before 2020. That means there's only 3 years left. Well, yeah. No, 2. A bit over 2 years left. So that's probably not going to happen. That will be a momentous event, one of the greatest of the 21st century, because it means that 1/5 of humanity will obtain freedom of speech, an essential ingredient if China's sages are to feel their full intellectual muscle. Once China democratizes, the impact on world politics will be immense and exciting. The threat of a major war between the US and China will then decrease significantly because the US will then respect China far more, rather than hating China's leaders for being such a brutal, contemptible dictatorship. Well, the actual leaders ad-libbing now, the actual leaders of America are the Jewish banksters, and they're even more contemptible and brutal dictators. Indirectly, they've killed over 200 million people in the 20th century. They're worse. The major, now democratic nations can then bully the remaining little dictatorships into becoming democracies, so that the world can become entirely democratic and hence far more peaceful, because democratic nations are far less likely to go to war with each other because their voting populations would not tolerate a warmongering leader who wants to go to war against the democratically elected leadership in another country, which didn't stop the US in Chile in 1970s, by the way. But on the whole, it's true. Once China democratizes, which hopefully is being planned for behind closed doors within the CCP, so that it is smooth without needing a civil war to topple the planet's most despised regime, then the Chinese people can be exposed to the international community or the Democratic Union of Nations, especially by having free access to the internet and satellite television and to books, etc. All these freedoms that are taken for granted in the Democratic Union are denied to China's citizens even today. As I say, today's China is a shithole. Once China's sages have free access to the ideas of the world and are free to express their own ideas, then one can expect a steamroll of intellectual creativity to power up. It will be overwhelming for little countries. Imagine the intellectual impact of 1.4 million Chinese sages from one culture. The US and Europe will be blown away. Perhaps I should mention briefly at this point, since I'm talking about large numbers of sages, the potential of India, which has a population of 1.2 billion, just a little under China's. I do not see India becoming much of a player on the global intellectual stage, since it has one major handicap. Indians are dumb. The global IQ scores I was mentioning above reflect negatively on India. So I don't give the number, I'm ad-libbing now. Oh, yes, I do a little later, in patience. To summarise briefly the global IQ distribution, the dumbest people in the world are the Australian Aborigines with an average IQ of 60. To them, counting is one too many. Next are the African blacks at 70, which to whites and Asians is borderline mentally retarded. Next is a great swathe of humanity, the Native Americans, the North African Arabs, the American blacks, Middle Easterners, the Indians, Southeast Asians, all at 85. At 100 are the Europeans and Russians, and at 105 are the Northeastern Asians, the brightest large group in the world. With a huge average IQ gap of 20 points between the Chinese and the Indians, you can forget about the Indians ever becoming a challenger to China for leadership in the global intellectual arena. And in case you're thinking economic growth will raise India's average IQ, let me state that IQ has one of the highest heritabilities at about 60% to 80%. 4. Democratic China's sophisticating global influence. Let us assume I'm right about China democratizing by about 2020. Now, that's too soon. By 2030, assuming I'm still alive, I expect to see China pulling away from the US in all intellectual fields. Most of the world's best brains will already have migrated to China, and a very powerful black hole effect will have established itself, sucking in the best brains to China, and hence creating an even larger, more attractive intellectual black hole. Once China becomes the most powerful, most creative intellectual centre on the planet, due partly to its own large, bright population and partly to its top salaries that have attracted the planet's best brains, then China can bring its old world mentality and judgment to the biggest question of the 21st century, namely, should humanity build artilects? That is, should human beings simply give up their current status as the planet's dominant species? I think a lot of people will simply not tolerate this, and when the IQ gap between human intelligence and machine intelligence is about to close, these people, whom I call Terrans, will go to war against those people who want to build artificial intellects, massively intelligent machines, whom I label cosmists, and against those people who want to add artilectual components to themselves to become artilects by increments, whom I call cyborgists. Such a war, which may take place around middle to late 21st century using 21st century weapons, would be the most passionate in history, because the stake this time is whether humanity survives. So the scale of the mass killing in an artilect war would not be in the millions as in 20th century wars, but in the billions. Giga death. This is such a huge issue that we need the best minds on the planet to be dealing with it. Sage, sophisticated, brilliant minds, not monocultured, naive, gullible, New World Americans who currently dominate the species dominance debate. I am impatient to see China flex its intellectual muscles and rally its sages to the huge task at hand. I want to see the sages of the old world blow away the silliness of the new world pundits who have no sense of history, who are blind to the negative sides of human nature, who haven't a clue how to balance the optimistic with the pessimistic views of humanity's future. I'm tired of America's Singularity Pollyannists and want to see them flush down a very big Chinese toilet and be replaced by the sages of the world, dominated by those living in the new China, a civilized, democratic China, with its 1.4 million sages, its deep sense of history, its wisdom and its vision. I despise today's China, but have great hopes for its future in the coming few decades. That's why I live in China. I can tolerate living in China's dark decade of the 2010s, hoping to see its blossoming in the 2020s and 2030s if I'm still alive. Ad-libbing now. I ran out of patience. I'm leaving this shithole. In a year or two I will head probably to Australia due to the generosity of my sister, who has offered to buy a one-bedroom apartment and let me live in it rent-free, which is very generous, and it's an offer hard to refuse. Okay, well that's it. So a pretty blunt essay, even by my standards. So, cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. YouTube channel name Hugo de GARIS. Ciao.